Before starting this video, please don't forget to leave your like and comment to show that you're not a robot. Seriously, if you watch my video and don't comment, start commenting, because YouTube's little robot doesn't like to see a video with lots of views and 0 comments. So comment anything and punch the like button. This story follows the life of a boy called Will. He doesn't have any magic, but for some very special reason, he studies at a magic academy. And since he doesn't have the basics to study at a magic school, he makes up for the lack of magic by using his sword and other special artifacts. One day in the classroom, we see Professor Edward giving a lesson on how people can produce fire with the help of catalysts and just a little magic, and out of all the students he could choose from, he decides to call Will to do this experiment. Even though he knows that Will is unable to use magic, Professor Edward does this because he hates Will. So Will goes to the front of the class and starts trying to do the spell, but as expected, nothing happens. The whole class wastes no time in making fun of him, calling him a failure. Edward asks everyone to calm down and reveals that he just wanted to personally demonstrate that Will is incapable of doing even the most basic spell. It turns out that Will is excellent at his studies, but has no magical talent whatsoever. So Edward despises him because he thinks he can attend a magic school without any magical talent. Suddenly, a student in the class casts a fire spell from his seat to set fire to the catalyst in front of Will. And although the teacher isn't worried about Will's safety, it would still be very bad for him if a student at the academy burned to death. So he asks Sion never to make that kind of mistake again. Sion apologizes and says that he was only trying to get Will's head right, since he's a failure who shouldn't even be studying at this academy. Sion's rude words are ignored, and Edward concludes the experiment and begins a speech about how magic is supreme in this world. So people who don't have magical talent have no right to exist in this magic academy. He says this while looking directly at Will. After class, Will feels tired because of all the hatred he's receiving. To make matters worse, Sion follows him outside the class and keeps trying to provoke him. Fortunately, there are still a few people on Will's side, one of whom is a girl called Colette, who defends Will's honor whenever she can. Sion asks her why she's defending this loser, since she's an honor student, while Will is a loser who should soon drop out of school. But she says that Will is the nicest person she's ever met, and that underneath those clothes he has a big giga shad body. She says that Will works much harder than any of them, and Sion is amazed for a moment, but then starts to laugh, because it doesn't matter how kind or hardworking Will is, because it won't change the fact that he can't use magic, so he'll never become a magic vendor. Sion and his friends leave Will alone for the time being. Then, as they walk through the corridors together, Colette tells Will not to bother with what Sion and Professor Edward were saying. Will says he's fine with it, as he's not really capable of using magic, and besides, he considers himself lucky that their hatred has made a pretty girl like Colette want to talk to him. Hearing this, Colette is embarrassed, so she tells Will that he'll need something more for her to want to go out with him. But Will says that he was just confirming a fact, because he thinks she's very pretty, and this makes Colette even more embarrassed, and she almost explodes from how red she gets. So she pushes him away a little so that she can think clearly and keep calm. She's technically poor, so she can't let herself fall for another poor guy so easily. After regaining her composure, she looks at Will, but he is busy looking at the sky, which is very beautiful. Out of nowhere, an invisible narrator with a very thick voice, a very good voice indeed, begins to reveal the lore of this anime, saying that a long time ago the people of this world lived in constant darkness, afraid of the celestial invaders who ruled them, until 5 magicians joined forces to oppose them and bring the light of heaven to everyone. These magicians came to be known as Magia Vendor. This title is granted only to the strongest, and no living wizard has ever been able to live up to it. Suddenly, Colette asks if the Ice Maiden is watching over them from above, and Will says he's sure she is, because he knows she's looking down on them right now, at the top of the world. At that point, you wonder who Dada the Ice Maiden is. So let's move on to more flashback. When Will was younger, he had a childhood friend called Elf, and she would tell him all about the sun and moon that she read in her book. Her dream was to see the real sunset, because according to the books, this is a very beautiful event. At the time, her dream was to become a magic seller with Will. Little Will, at the time, promised to become a magic seller with her. But although this may have been just a promise between children, Elf and Will really worked hard to make it happen. So Elf ended up becoming a magic seller. Will, on the other hand, had no talent for fulfilling his promise, but he still tried his hardest to climb as high as he could in the dungeon, even if he never made it. He doesn't intend to give up. Now we see Will entering a dungeon, and he asks Professor Warkner to calm down a bit, but the professor is rightly annoyed because Will has entered the dungeon again. Although he knew how dangerous it was to go up to the 7th floor alone, he was worried that Will would end up being killed at this rate. Will asks him for forgiveness, but also asks if he can get some extra credit. Warkner is still angry with Will for having entered the dungeon alone, but Will came back with proof that he had killed an evil guard, and for that, he received 2 extra credit points. After accomplishing this feat, Will celebrates with his pet, while Warkner prepares all the paperwork. But as he does so, he asks Will if he has given up on becoming a magic seller yet. To become one, Will would first need to advance to a higher institute, and for that, he would need a total of 7,200 credit. Normally, these students accumulate these credits by adding up all the subjects they practice. But since Will can't use magic, he'll never earn credits in the area of performing spells, which is a big disadvantage for him, as he can only earn points at the academy by doing things that don't involve the use of magic. Will is already aware of this, which is why he wanted to make up for it by doing extra practical work. But Warkner has already explained to him that it's practically impossible to earn enough credits to pass with practical work alone. Will realizes that his chances are slim, but he still wants to hold on to the hope that one day he'll be able to fulfill his promise of becoming a magic seller. However, Warkner tells Will that this goal is a long way off, and that if he doesn't earn enough points, he may not even be able to graduate. Warkner learns that Will didn't manage to earn any credits in his last exam, so unless he wants to fail, he needs to get 4 more credits by the end of the week. Will is shocked, as this means he only has 2 days. So, with few options left, he starts searching through his notes, hoping to find a monster that he can kill, and that will earn him at least 4 points. He's really desperate to find something, so although Warkner doesn't want to encourage Will to enter the dungeon, he ends up commenting on a monster that's perfect for this mission. The monster is on the 6th floor of the dungeon, and if he manages to kill it, he can get the credits he needs. Will runs up to Warkner to hug him in thanks for all his help. Warkner then pushes him away and says that even though he looks gay, he's not. Besides, this business of students grabbing teachers is something that could put their jobs at risk. Unfortunately, Sion was outside Warkner's office during the whole conversation. He ignores the hug and focuses only on the mission Will is trying to accomplish, which is to kill the monster called Basquero Wiley. Upon hearing this, Sion decides to go there first to defeat him, thus preventing Will from getting the credits he needs to continue at the school. Sometime later, Will reaches the 6th floor of the dungeon, and he's in a very good mood, as he's fought a Basquero Wiley before, so he knows this will be an easy victory for him. His pet doesn't think it's a good idea to stay so confident, but Will tells the little one that there's nothing to worry about, because as long as he's careful with the breath of Basquero Wiley's flame, he won't be burnt to a crisp like last time. As Will can't use magic, he relies entirely on his pet Kiki to sniff him out. Meanwhile, Sion and his friends are on a hate mission to make sure Will leaves the academy once and for all. Their plan is to kill the creature, and then beat Will badly. Everyone agrees with this plan, but one of his friends asks if it's really safe for them to go so deep into the dungeon, being that they're in a group of only 3. Sion is offended by this question, and says that with the strength he has, he could kill 10 creatures that Will can kill, and after he says this, everyone moves on, as none of them wants to annoy Sion. Sion continues walking while feeding his hatred for Will. In his opinion, someone who can't use magic shouldn't even dare to talk about the Magiavengers. Therefore, the mere fact that Will wants to be a Magiavenger offends him. After entering the depths of the dungeon, Sion turns to inform his friends of what they need to do, but a second later, one of his friends is punched so hard that he ends up slamming into the wall, and while everyone starts to freak out, Sion remains calm, staring at the monster. At the same time, Will hears the screams, and immediately realizes that someone must be in trouble, so he rushes over to help. He can't believe there are other people so deep in the dungeon, but from the sound he's just heard, they can't be far away. When Will arrives on the scene and sees all the shouting, he hides behind a wall and watches someone desperately shooting fireballs at the monster. Their attacks have no effect, and Sion starts pissing his pants. It turns out that this monster is an evil sentry, and as far as Will knows, defeating one of these can earn him 10 points. He's never seen a sentry like this in person, as the habitat of a creature like this should be deeper in the dungeon, so it doesn't make any sense for it to be on the 6th floor. He looks more carefully and realizes that the person fighting the evil sentry is Sion himself. To Will, it's obvious that Sion doesn't stand a chance, but for a moment Will hesitates, as Sion is a person who has done nothing but harm to him all this time. But then he is affected by the power of the flashback, remembering a moment with Euphoria when she told him that she liked how kind and brave Will was. He remembers that his waifu likes a gentleman, so he would never be forgiven if he abandoned Sion. At the time, Euphoria liked his kindness so much that she even gave him a pair of Naruto glasses, a pair of glasses that Will carries with him to this day. So, if he wants to remain the same person that the elf always liked, he'll have to put his personal grudges aside and save Sion, even if it only causes more problems in the future. So, when the sentry is about to kill Sion, Will approaches Perrin with his sword. At the same time, back at the academy, Professor Edward rushes into Orkner's office to tell him that Sion and his friends have entered the dungeon together without permission. He wants Orkner to use his familiar to track them down before they are killed, so Orkner takes out his bird and asks which direction Sion went. Edward replies that they must be on the 6th floor, and as soon as Orkner hears this, he's relieved, because it means that Will be with them, and as long as Will is there, he'll be able to deal with any monster that attacks them. He then uses his crystal ball to show Professor Edward what Will is doing at this very moment. If this were an 18+ anime, this item would be used by a perverted boy to see the wrong thing, but in this anime, the item was very useful, and showed that Will was completely overpowering an evil sentry. In the blink of an eye, Will has cut off one of the sentry's fingers, and when she tries to counterattack, he blocks the blow in midair and steps back to create space. Will then advances once more, and the sentry can't keep up. Before she even realized what was happening, Will was already on top of her, stabbing her in the shoulder. Sion can't believe what he's seeing, as he never thought Will would be so powerful. Even Edward is in shock, so Orkner explains that Will is an incredible anomaly. He possesses superhuman strength that a wizard could never have, and his body is harder than a Nokia. What's more, his observation skills are incredibly precise, allowing him to understand an enemy's movements and form countermeasures to strike back. Will is literally a Dark Souls warrior, built with dexterity, infinite vitality, infinite vigor, and enough strength to blow any enemy's head off. After he says this, we see Will fully anticipating the creature's attack and dodging, and during his dodge he manages to cut off the sentry's arm. Will may not be able to use magic, but he can easily make up for the lack of it. Now, as the sentry writhes in pain, Will grabs the sentry's sword in one hand and prepares to finish her off once and for all. As his last resort, the sentry fires a plasma blast, but with just a single blow, Will cuts the sentry in half, and proves that a strength build is much stronger than a mage build. When it's all over, Will approaches Sion to ask if he's alright. Sion still has a grudge against Will, but Will has just saved his life, so he can't call him a failure at this point. And even Professor Edward, after witnessing Will's strength, instead of getting excited about Will's strength, Edward actually decides to hate him even more, as he can't tolerate a student like Will being stronger than students who use magic. We then see Edward leaving Orkner's office furious, and although Orkner is proud of Will for saving Sion, he is still angry that Will has put himself in danger. However, once again, he has managed to defeat a very powerful monster, so he awards Will 10 points for killing the sentry. Out of nowhere, we are inflicted with the power of flashback again, and 5 years ago, we see that Will was the laughingstock of the whole school because of his lack of magic. And apparently the only reason he was able to enroll here was because he was a friend of Elpharia. But since by that time she had already become a magic vendor, everyone stopped being nice to Will. Since then, Will has had to put up with everyone ridiculing him, but that hasn't stopped him from working hard to graduate. The Orkner accompanied Will to be assessed by the principal, and she obviously had her doubts as to whether or not Will was fit to enter this magic academy. But as soon as she handed him a sword and the test began, Will ended up being able to counter one of her fire spells in a fraction of a second. She was very impressed and ended up giving Will permission to stay at the school, which left Orkner very surprised, as he didn't think it would be so easy to convince her. She knows that Will doesn't have magic, but she really wants to see how far Will's determination will take him. Will asks Cauldron if he can be by Elf's side again if he becomes strong, and she tells him that he'll have to try very hard and not be intimidated by the challenges along the way. But even then, there's no guarantee that he'll make it. Then, as Will leaves, she comments that it will be great fun to see what he can do. Magic back in the present. Will is currently in Orkner's class, as he teaches everyone about the Tower of Magic, and climbing the tower means advancing to the higher institute, to the highest floor, where you will become a magic vendor. However, to advance to the higher institute, you first need to create a new type of magic, or just earn more than 7,000 credits at that school. So, as it's very rare for someone to invent a new spell, students usually concentrate on earning credit. However, as this is a remedial class, all the students here run the risk of failing the school, especially Will. After class is over, the Vest meets with Will and asks him how he's feeling. Since Orkner's tutoring classes are notoriously rigorous, Will agrees that Orkner is a strict teacher. But to be honest, he's glad that Orkner is kind enough to offer tutoring, as most teachers wouldn't bother. As they round a corner, they notice a commotion and hear Sion's friends praising him for defeating the evil sentry. They don't ask how he survived, but somehow, when Lirio woke up, the only thing he saw was Sion and the defeated sentry, which means that Sion must have defeated it. Everyone believes that Sion is incredible for being able to kill a monster as powerful as an evil sentry, but deep down, Sion knows he's a fraud, because the one who really defeated the sentry was Will. At this point, Sion realizes that Will is passing by, so he goes over to Will and starts fighting with him again. However, for him, it's now very difficult to see Will as an inferior being, since he knows that Will could easily defeat him, and thinking quickly about it, he lets go of Will's jacket and starts to walk away without saying a word. As soon as Sion leaves, Colette asks Will if anything has happened between the two of them. At the same time, Edward has just entered the principal's office. He's demanding that Will be expelled immediately. She asks why Edward suddenly wants to expel Will, since he's in his 6th and final year at the academy. Edward tries to argue, saying that he can't allow Will to stay at this school because he's a warrior, not a wizard, and he can't tolerate anyone who doesn't use magic trying to outdo him. The principal takes Will's records and says that he has excellent grades in his writing and his magic reports are incredible. So, apart from the fact that he can't use magic, Will is definitely the definition of a perfect student, and if Will didn't have the dream of becoming a magic vendor, he could easily excel in any other profession he chose. She reminds Edward that the duty of this academy is to train strong people for the day of destiny. However, Edward says that the problem is precisely that Will wants to become a vendor guide. The principal understands Edward's point of view, so she proposes a solution. She suggests that Edward test Will personally, and if he doesn't pass the test, Edward can expel him. Edward asks if the principal is sure she wants to leave Will in the hands of a person who despises him, but the principal replies that it's fine, it won't make a difference. In fact, she thinks it will be even more fun to let the one who is known as the Dark Viper Wizard test a boy without magic. After that, we see that Will is preparing for his next lesson. He asks Colette to help him open his locker. She does it gladly, and he apologizes for always needing her to do it for him, since he can't use magic. Colette says she doesn't mind, but then notices Will's sword in the cupboard, and asks if he's still training with it. Will replies that he is, but that he hasn't been allowed to use it while he's at school, and in the dormitory, his roommate won't let him do anything dangerous. Later, Will and Colette go to the library to study together, and he's taking it very seriously. Despite having learned this topic before, Colette tells him to take it easy, as he's top of the class in writing, but Will says he needs to keep studying as hard as he can, as he can't afford to lose a single credit. He also likes to learn about the history of other races, especially the dwarves, because he identifies with them so much. The dwarves marched to war against powerful wizards, and despite the great challenge, they never gave up. Just then, Colette notices that Will has a strand of white hair, and says that it's probably because he's trying too hard. She offers to pluck it out, and even though Will says he doesn't have to, she insists on doing it. However, in the middle of this flirtation, Edward appears behind Will, and orders him to go to the wizarding salon alone, as there is something he must do. Shortly afterwards, Will arrives at the wizarding salon. There, Edward tells him that he will be offering him a special tutoring class, and that he should feel grateful for it. No one can believe that Edward would actually offer tutoring, and this is perfect proof that he doesn't mean well. The truth is that he wants to see what Will can really do. So he fires off a spell to let Will know that this is serious. He tells Will that if he manages to land a single blow on him, will earn 5 credit points. Otherwise, if he misses, he will be immediately expelled. He also tells Will that he can't refuse to take this test, and starts casting a spell with the intention of knocking Will out. While this is going on, Orkner ends up being called into the principal's office, and she apologizes for calling him at such short notice. But she thought Orkner should be informed that Edward is taking a test with Will. She casts a spell to show him the test Edward is taking, and forbids Orkner to interfere for any reason. She believes it's only fair that Edward should have his request granted, since Orkner got the same when he asked to look after Will. Still, the Orkner thinks it's too cruel to let Edward be the one to test Will. Because he's a man who almost became a salesman, he may have failed back then, but he still has the power equivalent to a salesman. So Will is in serious danger right now. Even though the Orkner says so, Will has managed to avoid being hit by Edward's spells so far. But so far, Edward has only used low-level dark magic. Will realizes he needs to fight back somehow, so he tries to run behind Edward and throw a kick. But Edward easily blocks it with a shield spell. The shield is too strong for Will to break through unarmed, and Edward calls him an idiot for thinking he could break through a magic shield with a kick. Edward then pushes him away, and Will begins to worry that he won't be able to win because Edward is simply too strong. Edward tells Will that he will limit himself to 2 spells, one to attack with fire, and the other to defend himself from Will's attacks. However, even though it is only one attack spell, Edward is not taking it easy, and casts his fire spell simultaneously, which gives Will a lot of work to dodge. Will knows that it will be very bad if he gets hit and starts to run away as much as he can, but Edward is still able to hit him. And when this happens, we can see that Edward is really enjoying testing Will. Will ends up falling to the ground, and realizes that there is no way to defeat Edward this way. But if he had his sword, he could at least hold his ground against Edward. At the same time, outside the spell room, the Vest was putting her things in her locker and was really worried about Will, since Edward asked Will to come alone to the tutoring class, and this is obviously not a good sign. Suddenly, Kiki came running into the room, covered in Will's blood, and started trying to get his sword from his locker. The Vest realizes that something really bad must have happened to Will, so she opens his locker. Meanwhile, Will was lying on the floor, and Edward was slowly walking towards him, saying that Will never be able to become a Jevender if he can't surpass him there. He says that magic has always reigned, even in the past, when the dwarves went to war against the wizards. Back then, an army of 10,000 dwarves were completely decimated by a single wizard, so a sword will never compare to a wand. But even though the odds are insurmountable, Will still wants to become a Jevender. He will do whatever it takes to achieve it. Edward can't understand why Will tries so hard, so he asks him if he has any noble goals he wants to achieve. Will then answers that he wants to be by the side of the girl he loves, but Edward thinks that reason is stupid. However, even though it may seem ridiculous to Edward, Will made a promise to the elf, and no matter what, he wants to be able to watch the sunset with her. At that moment, Colette arrives at the spell hall and throws Will's sword to him, and now that he is finally armed, Will manages to neutralize Edward's fire spell. He is shocked that Will was able to cut his spell, but realizes that it is because Will's sword is special. Even so, Edward still prefers to try to prove that Will is no match for a wizard. Will is terrified of Edward's flames, and if he could, he would have run away from this fight a long time ago. But facing Edward is the only way for Will to move forward, so he attacks Edward while dodging all of his attacks, and when he finally thinks he is close enough, he breaks through Edward's barrier and successfully scratches his cheek. Unfortunately for Edward, he is forced to admit that Will pass the test, so he gives him his 5 credits and leaves, his legs shaking, because if Will wanted to, he could have cut off his head. After that, Will falls to the ground exhausted, and the Vest runs to congratulate him on his victory. The director praises Will's performance, and the Orkner says that his strategy of diving into the attack to close the distance and attack from a blind spot was brilliant, and that it was something that only Will could do. And most impressive of all, Will's sword strike was strong enough to overcome Edward's shield, so maybe Will has what it takes to become a Jevender. Now, in a freaking flashback, we see the moment when Elfie presents Will with his pair of goggles. Right after that, she had to say goodbye, since she was halfway to the top of the dungeon. However, as Will was leaving, Will called Elfie and swore that he would find a way to climb the tower too, so that they could be together, even if the odds were against him, and he couldn't use magic. Will swore that he would keep his promise and watch the sunset with her. Elfie was moved by Will's speech, so she turned around with tears in her eyes and said that she would wait for him as long as it took. And when Elfie finally left, Will swore to himself that he would find a way to become a Jevender. Back in the present, Will is currently busy with his newspaper deliveries. It turns out that he has to work several jobs to pay for his studies, and while on his usual route, he runs into Donan, who greets him warmly, wishing him luck on his delivery route. Donan also adds that he will be visiting the tavern tonight, so Will replies that he will be waiting for him. As Will rushes out to finish his deliveries, he ends up tripping on some steps and drops his newspapers everywhere. But this is not a problem, because with his speed he manages to catch all the newspapers in the air and prevent them from falling. By chance, he loses a newspaper, so he approaches to pick it up. As he does so, he notices an article about Elfie, about how she created yet another type of original magic. She is the first person to develop 12 different original spells, and Will is very happy for his friend's success, and this motivates him even more to try his best down here too. He is about to continue with his deliveries, but then notices another section in the article, informing him that Elfie has personally passed on a request to the academy. He immediately runs to his dorm and starts asking the host if he can help him create a magic item on short notice. The host asks what the rush is, and Will tells him about the request Elfie made, and he says he wants to be the one to handle it. And since he doesn't have classes today, he is free to prioritize this request, and he starts getting dressed. The task involves collecting ice cores, as Elfie apparently needs a lot of magical catalysts. All participating students will be properly compensated, so Will only needs the host's magic items to help him. The host jokes, saying that Will always comes to make requests, but he also has no reason to refuse. The host then hands over his new and improved magic items, for which Will is very grateful. Down on the 4th floor of the dungeon, Will arrives to collect the ice cores, but there are a ton of students there doing the same thing. Still, Will expected this, since Elfie is very famous, so he's going to do his best to outdo them all. However, just as he's about to start, a huge explosion rings out in the cave, and it seems like it was caused by Sion, who just blew up a group of enemies. His friends praise him for his display of skill, but inwardly, Sion is agonizing over the fact that he's still nowhere near Will's level of strength. When Will sees Sion, he's honestly impressed by the magical power he used. Anyway, with all these students here, Will never have a chance to get any ice cores, so his only option is to go deeper into the dungeon. As Will descends, he happens to see a girl in distress, so he springs into action, and moments later, all 3 monsters have been cut in half. The girl is shocked by what she has just witnessed, as this is the first time she has seen a student use magic on his sword. Will asks if she is okay, and after the initial shock has worn off, she says she is fine and introduces herself as Iris. After this, we cut to a lecture by Orkner. He is talking about the great achievement of creating a new magic, and this is an achievement so great that it grants a direct advancement to the top of the Tower of Magic, and the new magic is usually named after the person who created it, or at least has some words associated with it. For example, a dark magic spell, used by Edward, is named after a wizard from ancient times. Therefore, if any of the students here manage to create a new magic, they will be recorded in history forever. Aluna raises her hand and asks Orkner if this means that Elphara is an incredible wizard, since she created 12 spells, and without a doubt, Orkner believes that Elphara is incredible, as it is not common for a wizard to create 12 original spells on their own. Therefore, it is no exaggeration to say that she is one of the greatest magicians who ever lived. After hearing about Elphara's accomplishments, Colette is forced to admit that she is as amazing as Will had told her, but her friend Rose starts teasing her, saying that she is jealous of Elphara because she is in love with Will. Colette becomes embarrassed and yells at Rose for saying such ridiculous things, but this ends up causing a disturbance in the class. Then, the Orkner turns around and tells her to sit down and be quiet. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, Will and Iris are walking through a passage. After Will introduces himself to her, Iris remembers hearing about him. At the time, she heard that a boy could not use magic. He was nicknamed talentless. And this is also something unprecedented in the academy. Will is shocked to learn that people actually call him that. Will then asks the girl if she hates him because he doesn't have magic. But Iris doesn't see any reason to hate Will or anything like that, especially after he saved her a few minutes ago. Even though he doesn't know how to use magic, she has a sincere respect for people who have their own special talents. Will gets a little nervous. He then changes the subject and asks Iris if she's there because of Elfaria's request. Iris confirms, saying that she wants to be useful to the Magiavender, and that one day, she hopes to become one of the people who hold up the sky. And she's not speaking metaphorically. In fact, in this world, people can't see the real sky. What they actually see is a false sky, known as the Great Barrier, and according to legend, when the Great Barrier falls, the world will once again be shrouded in darkness, and a great calamity will begin. This is why the students are motivated to fulfill the Magiavender's request, not only because they admire them, but also because they believe it will help support their mission to keep the sky up. Iris mentions that she had the honor of meeting Elfaria in person before, and Will is surprised, so she begins to tell him how it happened. One day she was trapped in the dungeon, and when her life began to flash before her eyes, and she could see no way out, she was saved by Elfaria, who immediately asked if Iris was okay. This was an experience she will never forget, and so she wants to do everything she can to help Elfaria. However, although she came to get the ice cores, she was unable to find any, and her search spell is also not detecting anything. So she assumes that the students must have collected them all, but Will does not think that is the case. He shows Iris a shard of ice that frostwalkers leave behind when they move, and normally it would be about 1 millimeter across, but this one is huge, and that can only mean that there must be a powerful frostwalker nearby, probably somewhere that Iris's search spell can't detect. Iris asks Will how he can know all this if he can't use magic. So he explains that he studies magic because he thinks it's amazing. But magic isn't omnipotent, especially in a place like the dungeon. So those who don't have magic need to use all their knowledge, wisdom, and experience to make up for it. Iris asks what Will means by experience, and since they're in a large open room, Will's experience tells him that there will be a boss fight here, because an arena this large wouldn't exist for nothing. Suddenly, the Frostwalker tries to sneak up on them, but Will rushes forward, pulling Iris to safety, and when she finally realizes what's going on, she quickly realizes that the enemy they're about to face is a Frost Rex. A Frost Rex is the most evolved form of the Frostwalker Pokemon, and is worth 6 credits on its own, so it's basically a special boss on the 4th floor. The Frost Rex fires an ice laser at them. Will jumps out of the way to avoid being frozen to death. He puts Iris down, and asks her to stay behind him while he deals with the Frost Rex. But Iris warns him that physical attacks won't work against the Rex, as anything it touches will be instantly frozen. For this reason, melee combat has been completely ruled out as an option, but Will isn't worried, as he has a plan in mind to deal with the Rex. As Rex begins charging up another laser blast, Will prepares a magic item he received from Rost and charges at him. He dodges the ice beam and lands behind Rex. Rex is unable to track Will, so he begins firing in random directions. While he is not paying attention, Will uses the magic item to latch onto Rex's body, and then runs around him to wrap him up. Soon, he is completely entangled in the wires, and Will states that Rex's main weaknesses are fire magic and explosive attacks. So just as Rex is about to fire another blast at him, Will activates the magic item, which causes the wire to ignite, reaching the bombs, which cause a massive explosion. Rex is reduced to a pile of rubble. Will pulls out his tool and makes a mental note to remember to thank the host for his help. Iris is shocked by what she has just seen, but then her true personality emerges, and she comments that Will is much stronger than the rumors led her to believe. She wonders how she should report her findings, but while she is thinking, Will catches her eye. He says that they have obtained a very good ice core, keeping his real personality a secret and thus avoiding suspicion. Sometime later, we see Iris running the wizard's tower, and as she walks through the halls and takes off her disguise, she recalls what she learned from following Will. He cannot really use magic, but he makes up for it in creative ways. He also has an insane sense of battle, and has a lot of experience in it. So, while he is not qualified to be a wizard, he is an incredibly skilled warrior. Reaching the end of the hall, Iris approaches a large door and opens it to meet the magic vendors. She asks them for a moment of their time and apologizes if she is interrupting something important. But Carriot tells her that there is no need to apologize, as they were just having a boring meeting, but the situation is still dire, as if the barrier of the sky were to be broken now, the world would surely be destroyed. The celestial invaders watching from the other side of the sky would instantly overwhelm them, all because of the small number of mages they have now. So they need to hurry and find more promising mages to help in the fight that will happen on that fateful day. Otherwise, the calamity described in the prophecies will come to pass, and they cannot allow that to happen. They ask Iris how her observation mission went, and if she found anyone useful. She confirms that she managed to find a promising person who could be useful to their cause. The person is the talentless, magic-unable Will, and she recommends that he be given a position in the tower. Carriot and Elena are against the idea, but Zell thinks it could be fun, while Elfie just chooses to keep her opinion to herself. Zell honestly doesn't care who it is, as long as they are useful, but Elena thinks it would be crazy to bring a person without magic to their side. They are about to start a fight over this, but Carriot calms them down and says that a decision doesn't need to be made now, as the big magic festival will be happening soon, and they can use those results to decide. Usually at the festival, the most useful naturally end up in the top positions, so if Will doesn't make it, then he's not cut out for the tower. With that, they end the meeting, and everyone teleports outside. Elfie stays behind, and then she finally expresses that she is glad to hear that Will is still trying to fulfill his promise, and she says that she will wait for him as long as it takes. As part of the next test, the students must participate in fights against golems, and if they can defeat one, they will pass. Sion and Colette are the first, and both manage to defeat their golems with ease. Meanwhile, Will is fighting his. Will tries to run behind the golem to strike, but when the students see him about to attack with his fists, they start to mock him for not being able to use magic, which distracts him and gives him enough time for the golem to hit him, sending him across the room. The students start to retreat after being satisfied with Will's failure, but on the other side of the room, there are other students who are having no trouble with the golems. They are Lehana and Ignal, and there is one more student who approaches and starts to cast ice magic. He launches ice shards at all the golems, causing them all to be encased in solid blocks of ice. His name is Julius, and he is one of the top 3 students in the academy, along with the other 2. Lehana praises Ignal and Julius for their skills, but the magic competition will start soon. However, there is no reason for either of them to open up to the other, and when talking about the so-called magic competition, Julius says that he would like to declare a friendly war against them. He says that he will use his newly mastered ultimate technique to defeat them, and as a token of his sincerity, Julius offers them an ice rose. But neither Ignal nor Lehana seem to mind this. And these 3 are practically celebrities in this school, because they are the only students who have obtained more than 10,000 points out of the total 12,000 that can be obtained, and unfortunately, Will is nowhere near that level. At the moment, he does not even have enough credits to graduate, since this is his last year in school. So, while Will is sitting there wondering what he's going to do, Julius and his friends come up to him and start taunting him about his lack of magical ability. Will simply moves out of the way so as not to cause trouble, and as Julius and the others leave, Will overhears them talking about the big magic festival, and Will hadn't realized it was that time of year. Later that day, during lunch, Colette approaches Will. He says that his only hope of becoming a magic vendor is to be chosen at the magic festival, as trying to graduate through studies alone isn't very practical, and there have been cases of students being selected without having the 7,000 credits needed to graduate. The magic festival is a big event that takes place every 2 years. It holds a lot of different experiments, and attracts the most powerful wizards in the tower, who hope to find talented and promising people. The festival is a place where the different magical factions fight for the right to recruit the best students. And it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that admissions to the higher institute are decided during the festival. There are 5 factions in total: the Ice faction, the Elf faction, the Flame faction, and the Light faction. All of these factions, except the Light faction, are led by their respective magic vendors. Will doesn't think it's likely that he'll be chosen, as he's already popularly known as a failure, and in order to be noticed, he'd have to have some kind of incredible magic. Colette reveals that she's heard rumors that the Watchers will come looking for talented student, but Will thinks the Watchers are just an urban legend. He also doesn't think it's possible for a student with no magical talent like himself to have a place in the festival, so he'll stay behind the scenes, helping only with the preparation of the event. However, Colette thinks that Will could change the way people see him if he entered the festival this year and showed them what he was capable of. But Will doesn't want to enter, since the festival would end up turning into an athletic competition if he were there. He already tried to participate in the festival once in his second year. Back then, he was booed and thrown off the stage for using physical attacks. He got a bad reputation because of this, and he still hasn't gotten over the humiliation. Therefore, he really doesn't want to participate. Because of the event, students from all over the school have started practicing and preparing for the festival, and Colette reminds Will that in addition to the high-level magicians, many scouts from the capital will also be there. So, even if Will doesn't get a spot as a magic vendor, he might be called upon for another career. The Magic Festival is a great place to show off your skills, and Colette really wants Will to show everyone how capable he is. But Will still doesn't think he's a good person to participate without being able to use magic. At that moment, Colette notices something strange, so she goes to one of the lockers and tells Will that there's something strange about it. It's well hidden, but she can feel a barrier there. Will asks if she's sure it's not just a trick, but Colette can tell that the barrier is designed to block sound and obstruct vision. She could break it with her magic. However, she thinks that might be problematic, so she asks Kiki to do it. After the barrier is removed, they find a hidden staircase behind the lockers, which leads to a secret gambling house. A group of students gather there to make bets on who will win the Magic Festival. Colette finds it deplorable that the students would turn their locker room into an illegal gambling den. But then Will notices Sion standing in front of them, and is surprised to see him there, as Sion doesn't seem like the type of person who likes to gamble. Sion starts yelling at Will to stop meddling in his life, but Colette intervenes and warns Sion that if he fights with Will for no reason, she will make him regret it. Sion calms down, and Will asks him again what he is doing there, since he doesn't seem to be participating in all the bets. Sion doesn't feel the need to answer Will's questions, and indirectly, he ends up revealing that he is there to see if people were betting on him or not. He also seems a little upset because no one believes he will win, despite him being the fourth best student in the school. The three best students have more credits than him, but Sion only has around 9,000 points because he failed a writing test once. Since then, he has been trying his best to make up for the lost credits and catch up. He says that his magical abilities are still on par with Lahanna and the others, so he has just as much chance of winning the festival as any of them. After revealing all of this, he begins to wonder why he is trying to justify himself to Will. After that, the day goes on as normal, and when classes end, Will gets up to leave. Before he leaves, Colette catches his eye and asks if he is free after school, as she would love to hang out with him. Unfortunately, Will has work to do in the evening, so he won't be able to spend time with her. Later that night, we see that Will is at Gina's tavern, working as a waiter. He brings a tray of food and drinks to Donan, who feels bad about the fact that Will is working so hard all the time. He delivers newspapers in the morning, has classes during the day, and then works at the tavern at night. But Will just says that he has to work hard, because he unfortunately doesn't qualify for a scholarship from the school, which means he has to pay for everything out of his own pocket. Donan mentions that he heard something about the big magic festival that's happening soon, and suggests that Will attend, but Will immediately rejects the idea, because he doesn't want to be humiliated again. Gina yells at Will to get back to work, and points out that Donan is working much harder than him. We then see the host, who is also working as a waiter here, although he's only doing it as a favor to Will, since tonight is very busy, and one of Gina's employees quit, and all this extra work would be thrown on Will's shoulders, so the host decides to help him. After dinner is over, Will and the host start washing the dishes, and the host asks Will if he's really okay working here, because the salary he gets from the dwarves isn't very high. He could ask Werkner to help him find a better paying job, but Will doesn't want to bother Werkner too much. Besides, he really likes the people here, and working with them is fun for him. They are honest, caring, and treat him with kindness, which is why Will respects them a lot. Things are going well, but a few moments later everything is ruined when Julius enters the tavern just to cause trouble. As soon as he enters, the first thing he does is start insulting the dwarves who work in the tavern. Julius then notices Will's presence and starts laughing to himself, saying that a loser like Will is only good for being around barbarians like the dwarves. This irritates Donan, but the other dwarves stop him because they can't afford to get into a fight with a wizard. Julius starts threatening Donan, saying that he and all the other dwarves are just immigrants who came here after the Celestials destroyed their world, and that the humans have graciously allowed their kind to live here without any problem. Therefore, a dwarf like him has no right to look at Julius like that. Donan calms down because he knows that there is nothing he can do, and everything Julius said about the dwarves being refugees is true. They were forced to come here after their world was destroyed. But even if the same thing happened to the elves, the dwarves are treated with contempt by the humans here. If Donan were to attack Julius for what he said, all the dwarves in the city would suffer the consequences for it. That is how the world works here, but Will cannot tolerate such injustice. He decides that today will be his last day of work here, and since he is no longer employed at this establishment, he is free to do whatever he wants, without Gina having to face any consequences for it. The first thing he does is go to Julius's desk and tell him to take back what he said about the dwarves. They say that the dwarves are hard workers and have managed to thrive even under adverse conditions. Therefore, Julius has no right to call them barbarians. Julius, dissatisfied, kicks his plate of food at Will, and his two friends stand up, ready to beat Will. However, they do not realize that throwing a plate of food at him counts as assault. Therefore, everything Will does from now on can be classified as self-defense. Will immediately grabs the two boys by their shirts. They experience firsthand the bitter taste of the floor. Julius gets dirty in the process and begins to complain, saying that it has been a long time since he suffered such humiliation. He decides to make Will pay for what he did, and the room begins to freeze as Julius takes out his wand and begins to attack Will. Will jumps back to dodge Julius's ice blows, but he does not have his sword and is in an enclosed space. Julius manages to trap him with the ice and stick Will to the wall. He then steps in to freeze him, and the host is ready to step in and save Will. But before Julius can freeze him, he looks into Will's eyes, expecting to see him beg for his life. However, Will shows no sign of fear. Given this, Julius decides to change his plans. Instead of freezing Will there, he wants to do it at the magic festival so he can humiliate him in front of the entire school. Will agrees to fight Julius at the magic festival, and Julius says that if he wins, he will get Will expelled from the school once and for all. But Will says that if he wins, he wants Julius to apologize to all the dwarves he disrespected. So the deal is made. We then move on to the day of the big magic festival, and it is clear that everyone is excited to see what the students can do. One of the leaders of the fire faction tells his people to keep an eye out for a talented student, as you never know who has the ability to become a magic vendor. The first event involves the dragon races, and Lahana has been holding a strong lead over the other competitors for a while now, but that's not the only competition going on at the moment. Lahana, unsurprisingly, wins the dragon race in record time, so the next event will be the race to the crown, and it looks like Sion will be participating. He's in a good mood, as Colette has personally come to ask him to join her team. She must have finally realized how strong Sion is, which is why she wanted to work with him instead of Will. But when he opens the door to the training room, he's shocked to find Will there as well. Colette explains that she was inviting Sion to join her and Will on a team because Will needs a team with a total of 21,000 credits to compete in the race for the crown. And since Will's credits are low, the only person she could ask to fill the last spot was Sion. Will apologizes for dragging Sion into his problem, but Sion sees no reason to help Will in the first place because Will would suddenly want to participate in a higher level event like the race for the crown. But while Sion is yelling, Will looks at Julius, and Sion realizes that Julius is the only one Will sees as an enemy. Colette explains that something happened between Julius and Will, and suddenly Sion decided that he would participate in the race for the crown event. Sion is furious that Will is ignoring him, and he still hasn't gotten over feeling inferior to Will, who he considers a failure. As the event is about to begin, commentator Mike introduces himself, and as his co-commentator, Edward is also there. However, Mike doesn't like this, since Edward is the most hated teacher in the school for being so strict and scary. Mike is afraid that Edward will kill him before the end of the festival, but the show must go on, so he announces the main event of the day, the race to the crown. A spell is cast over the stadium, transforming it into a full battle map. There is a volcano zone, a swamp zone, a rock zone, a forest zone, and finally a field zone. And unlike the other events, the race to the crown is a team competition held between threes. All teams will start at the outer edge of the field and work their way to the central stadium. In the center of the stadium, there is a giant crown, and the first team to collect it will win. But of course, this is easier said than done, as all areas of the game are filled with traps of all kinds. You are allowed to take the shortest route to the stadium, and also to impede the other team. Therefore, out of all the events, this will certainly be the most brutal battle royale. Edward adds that the event was created to be a practical demonstration of how the teams would deal with an invasion together. However, no one is focusing on team coordination. Everyone just wants to see high-level battles between the school's best students. And if there were an illegal gambling ring in the school, which there is, Ignale's team would be the most popular of all. And as expected, the team with the least popularity is the team led by Will. The students start to laugh at Will for daring to think that he could participate in an event like the race for the crown. But Will is not going to lose confidence this time. As the event participants head to their designated starting points, the Orkner is shocked to see that Will also intends to compete. The Orkner tries to dissuade Will, but he had already made up his mind from the start, and nothing the Orkner says can stop him. Will apologizes for not listening to the Orkner, but even if it makes him the laughing stock of the school, this is a competition he wants to win no matter what. Will then walks away, and the Orkner accepts that he won't be able to talk him out of it anymore, so he reminds Will that he was warned about the risks involved. So if things end badly for him, he'll have no one to blame but himself. With all the students in position, the event can officially begin. The students rush forward, and Julia's team is the first to come across some traps that have been placed on the battlefield. As they get closer, the cubes join together and form an army of golems that stand in Julia's way. With so many golems in one place, this would easily become too difficult an obstacle for many students. However, Will continues to advance at full speed and shows no signs of slowing down. The students start to mock him for trying to get through a swarm of golems, since he can't use magic, and he couldn't even defeat a single golem during an exercise. Even so, Will continues to run towards the golems, and before attacking, he signals to the Vest, who casts a spell to create a magical gauntlet for him. With this gauntlet, Will manages to completely demolish all the golems in his path. All the spectators are shocked, but the Orkner had already expected something like this to happen. Since Will is attacking using a magical gauntlet, he can deal a significant amount of damage even without his sword. And since it was the Vest that created it, technically this isn't against the rule. He goes against all the predictions and illegal bets, and the first one to get through the horde of golems is Will, who is now heading straight for the crown. However, something Will doesn't know is that Sion has been reliving the moment he was saved by Will over and over again in his head. He sees this as one of his worst failures and would rather die than face such a terrible humiliation. So he has been striving to improve himself and to explore every strength his body can generate. But even with all his hard work, Will still outperforms him without magic. In the race for the crown, Will and his team have a huge advantage, since the goal is to reach the stadium and win the crown. The other competitors will have to pick up the pace if they don't want to fall behind. Will reaches the rocky area, and as he gets there, cube traps are activated and begin firing stone bullets at him and the other competitor. As the bullets come towards him, Will stops and uses the gauntlet to punch the ground and create a stone wall that blocks the projectiles. He then jumps forward and asks the Vest for help again. She casts a spell that creates a dozen swords for Will, and he proceeds to use them as projectiles to destroy all the cubes in his path. Mike then announces that Will's team has traversed the rocky area with ease, and that no traps have yet posed any danger to them. He says that their teamwork has been flawless. Although Sion has not done anything yet, the spectators oppose Will and try to dismiss his skill, saying that the magic of the vest is doing all the heavy lifting. In fact, the magic of the vest does play an important role, but the effectiveness of the weapons in battle comes down to Will's technique. The scouts are starting to take notice of Will and his incredible ability to detect and neutralize traps, and as much as he dislikes Will, even Edward has to acknowledge his hard work. All the time Will has spent in the dungeons has given him a great deal of experience, and his superhuman reflexes give him the ability to take advantage of even the smallest openings available. Another team is frustrated at losing to someone who has no magic, but their hatred for Will distracts them so much that they end up falling into a flower trap and are eaten alive. The other teams face similar problems with the other traps scattered along the way, but despite all the brutal obstacles, Will still manages to maintain the lead with his team. The turn of events causes a huge commotion in the stadium, so much so that Julius can hear everything from where he is. He asks his teammates for an update on the status of the event, and Julius's teammates use a detection spell to locate the rest of the competitors. From what they can see, it looks like Will is in the lead by a large margin. If they don't do something about him soon, Julius could lose. However, Julius doesn't seem too worried, as he has a plan to deal with Will himself. Meanwhile, Will and the others eventually reach the last zone, the forest zone. As Will runs ahead, he triggers several magic circles at once, and soon realizes that it is a chain circle trap. But that won't be a problem, as he has a perfect counter to something like that. If all the circles ignite at the same time, he just needs to make them cancel each other out. He then begins to carve an area around each magic circle, and by rotating them, he can make all the spells fire at each other and explode. Mike excitedly announces that we'll manage to get past the forest traps without any problems, and asks Edward if he has any comments to make, since he was the one who set that dark trap. But Edward just clicks his tongue, since Will manage to get past his trap with ease, even with all the advantage Will has accumulated. As he gets closer to the stadium, the chances of him encountering another team and being attacked increase drastically. He has had to defeat a few teams, but there is one team in particular that he wants to face, so Will prefers to run ahead and set up an ambush for Julius. However, while he is on his way to secure the high ground for his strategy, the tables are turned when Julius attacks him directly. Will is fine, since the attack did not hit his body directly, but he cannot understand how Julius managed to get there, considering the huge advantage they had. Furthermore, Julius is alone, which makes Will worry that the other members of his team might be hiding somewhere to ambush him. Without wasting any time, Julius begins to launch a barrage of ice crystals at Will, who, with no other option, has to run. He doesn't have time to worry about a possible ambush now, so he decides to focus solely on his fight against Julius. But it seems that Sion is also starting to get excited. He begins the process of casting an incredibly powerful infernal spell. The problem is that his blow will also hit Will, which makes Colette ask him to run away. When Sion fires the spell, Colette acts quickly and creates a stone wall in front of Will, preventing him from being burned in the process. Sion's explosion generates a huge shockwave throughout the battlefield, leaving Will a little stunned by what just happened. He looks around and realizes that the forest has been completely incinerated. Sion then approaches Will, saying that Julius was in the way. He may have even eliminated Julius too, but for Colette there is no doubt. Sion casts that spell with the intention of killing Will. Outraged, Colette asks him what he thinks he is doing, but Sion believes his actions are justified. He agreed to join their team so that Will could participate in this event, and now he wants the favor to be repaid with a one-on-one fight between him and Will. Unable to understand the sudden change, Will ask Sion about the reason for this fight and why it has to be now, but Sion is unwilling to explain anything. Instead, he simply fires a spell at Will. Colette tries to intervene and stop Sion, but before she can do anything, a wall of ice appears in her path created by Julius, who somehow managed to survive the deadly blast. Now Colette is in trouble and Will wants to rush to her aid, but Sion won't let him leave without a fair fight. To prevent Will from escaping, Sion fires a few fireballs, one of them hits his sword, knocking it out of his hand. Will tries to reason with Sion so they can settle this some other time, but Sion is determined to fight him, so he tells Will to take his sword so they can duel. With no other option, Will agrees to face him. To Sion, Will seemed pathetic from the first day he saw him, but at the time, Sion felt genuine sympathy for Will, and he genuinely wanted to help him overcome all the bullying, so he tried to convince Will to become his subordinate, because that way no one could bully him anymore. However, Will completely ignored him and kept walking alone. Sion runs to catch up with him, but when he grabs Will and tells him to take the offer seriously, Will looks him in the eye and tells Sion to get out of his way. Sion may have felt sorry for Will, but Will never felt sorry for himself, not even for a minute. He was always focused on his goal, and Sion couldn't accept the fact that Will had rejected his kindness and ignored him as if he were just a secondary character. So from that day on, Sion started to hate Will. Back in the present, Will is running through the trees, trying to escape Sion's fireballs, but when he hides behind a tree, Sion throws a few more fireballs that almost hit him, sending him flying across the forest floor. He holds on with his sword, but Sion sends another flame attack his way. Will is then forced to use his sword to deflect the attack, and while he is distracted, Sion catches him off guard with a whip of fire, sending him flying through the forest. Will finally manages to free himself, but Sion is ready to attack him with a devastating expulsion spell. Luckily, Will deflects this spell as well, but this starts to irritate Sion, since Will is doing nothing but dodging when they should be having an intense fight. Will responds by saying that he does not want to fight Sion, and the reason he joined this competition in the first place was to get justice for Donan and the other dwarves, so he has no time to waste on a pointless fight with Sion now. Sion is furious that Will is still not taking him seriously, even in a situation like this, so he says that he will burn Will until there is not even his ashes left if he does not start treating this as a serious fight. Everyone is shocked to see Sion fighting Will, even though they should be on the same team. Mike asks Edward for his opinion on the matter, and Edward says that it is embarrassing for students on the same team to fight each other. Since the goal of the competition is teamwork, Will's team will certainly lose points with the scouts, but at the same time, he seems very pleased that Sion is hurting Will's chances of winning this event. Everyone in the audience is shocked, and the scouts are definitely noticing this pattern of behavior. Rost is concerned for Will's safety, but he also can't help but be intrigued to find out what will happen next. As he watches, Iris approaches him and asks if she can sit next to him. Rost seems to know her and says that he doesn't mind her sitting there, so Iris sits down and immediately starts cheering for Will. Rost is surprised that she supports Will, since she always seemed like a more reserved person. Iris admits that this isn't like her, but after being introduced to Will, she couldn't help but feel captivated by him. Rost can understand this feeling, but he's starting to get jealous of Will being so popular with the girls, and even with Sion, since technically, he's fighting because Will doesn't pay attention to him. Rost believes that he's the person who roots for Will the most, since he's his roommate, and he can also say the same for Colette, since she's always been by Will's side. Even now, when she's being attacked by Julius, the only thing on her mind is how to make Sion stop fighting Will so that he doesn't lose this competition. However, she won't be able to do anything about their fight while Julius is attacking her. Julius mocks Colette for running away from him all this time, but Colette has never liked that title, so she threatens him, saying that he will regret it if he calls her that again. Julius sends more ice spears at Colette, so she uses earth magic to create a wall in front of her to block the ice spell. However, Julius wasn't just aiming at her, as one of the ice crystals hits the ground and activates one of Edward's traps. Before she can react, she is caught in a massive energy blast. Meanwhile, viewers have started to notice something strange about Julius. He is appearing on all the screens at once. Somehow, Julius is fighting against all the students involved in this competition, but the method he is using remains an absolute mystery. Julius also challenges Ignal's team, and they don't mind the added challenge of facing Julius. But before they can begin, Ignal says he wants to return the ice flower Julius gave him. So, with a wave of his wand, Ignal causes Julius's ice flower to appear in the sky, distracting Julius long enough for Ignal to create a magic circle above his feet and defeat him in an instant. While the others are confused, Ignal recognizes that this is what Julius meant when he said he would win using his trump card. He admits that Julius is amazing for using a spell from a Jevender. Mike isn't sure what exactly happened, but Ignal just defeated Julius, who suddenly appeared right in front of him. Coincidentally, Mike bet all his money on Ignal, so he's really excited to see him perform well. Meanwhile, from the top of the stadium, two elf girls from the elf faction are watching the festival. Lithia asks Chalia what she thinks of the academy students, and all Chalia can say is that they are doing as well as she expected. The general opinion about the competition is that Julius or Ignal will win, and that Will might have had a chance if Sion hadn't done what he did. Sion's friends know that this is out of character for him, so they wonder what could have driven him to act so rashly. Liryu thinks he can understand why Sion is doing all this. It's not that he's trying to get Will expelled because he hates him, he just wants to prove a point. So we're back to Will and Sion's fight, and Will can't understand what he did to deserve so much hatred from Sion. Since enrolling in this school, he's never done anything wrong, but he's always been bullied for his lack of magic. He knew he was a supporting character, so he never asked for recognition or tried to be selfish, but people kept picking on him. That's why, on the day Sion tried to help him, Will took it as another act of bullying and left. Back in the present, Will dodges another one of Sion's fireballs. But the next attack Sion has prepared won't be easy to avoid. He summons a guardian, and Will is shocked because summoning a guardian is actually a high-level magic. Sion sends the guardian to attack Will, and he needs to think fast to avoid getting burned. So he sticks his sword in the ground and jumps on the guardian, whose form is a bird, which soon has one of its wings cut off. However, the guardian regenerates its wings in an instant and starts attacking Will from behind. Now Will has his attention divided between dealing with Sion, who is attacking from the front, and defending himself from the guardian from behind. He makes his decision in a split second, jumping out of the way of the guardian's attack and moving his sword to his other hand to block Sion's attack. But Will is still fighting Sion's flames, and he ends up dodging the fireball, and all of this leaves both him and Sion breathless. Back at the stadium, Edward is shocked by the level of skill that Sion has just demonstrated, as it is far above the level that any student should have. Not only was he able to use that powerful spell from earlier in the fight, but he was also able to summon a guardian to aid him in the battle. The scouts had not realized that Sion had such precise control over his magic, and this did not match the reports they had received about him, as all his records said that he was a good student of magic, but not outstanding enough to be labeled as one of the school's greatest talent. However, something must have happened recently for him to improve so much. They will need to prepare a new report, as it seems that they have found their last candidate. Will also notices that Sion has become much stronger than he was before, but Sion starts yelling at Will because he knows that Will is still holding back against him. He wants Will to use all the strength he showed when he was facing the sentry that day, but the situation is different from back then. It's one thing to give your all to kill a monster, and it's another thing to give your all to defeat a classmate. Sion can't believe that after all these years of hating Will and humiliating him, Will still doesn't hold a grudge against him. However, Will never said that he didn't hold a grudge against Sion. He can't even count the number of times he's thought about getting revenge for all the things Sion has done to him. But now is not the time for that, because he needs to focus on defeating Julius. Hearing these words coming out of Will's mouth makes Sion very angry, because even now Will is still ignoring him. He doesn't care about Will's problem, or any other goal he wants to achieve. He just wants Will to look at him and see him as a worthy rival, not an insignificant obstacle. And after so much insistence, Will finally decides to take the fight seriously, and Sion is happy about that, so he starts casting another spell. Will realizes that if he tries to attack now, the Guardian will certainly intercept him, so he decides to wait for the moment when Sion casts his spell to counterattack. When Sion finishes incanting the spell, he orders the Guardian to attack while he simultaneously casts a wide-range annihilation spell. This simultaneous attack would normally be unavoidable. However, Will has already seen the trajectories of all the fireballs, so he advances and deftly runs between the gaps in the attack. He then leaps into the air and destroys the Guardian's core, and with no more obstacles in his way, he charges straight at Sion to eliminate him. Sion had expected this from Will, but he still doesn't want to give up, so he throws a fireball at Will at the last minute. However, before the two can face each other, Colette creates a giant stone wall between them. Will and Sion weren't expecting this and fall to the ground, and when they look to the side they see Colette covered in smoke, and most of her clothes are burned. Will asks Colette what happened to Julius, and she replies that she beat him to the point where he turned to ice and disappeared. Sion is confused when she says that Julius disappeared, but then he notices something even more shocking. Colette's clothes are almost completely burned away. He says that she is showing too much skin for a noble lady, but she reminds Sion that it was his flames that did this to her clothes in the first place. She then tells Will that he must go on without them, as he needs to catch up to Julius before he can claim the crown. Sion tries to argue that he hasn't finished the duel with Will yet, but Colette stops him and says that it's very important that Will beat Julius. This was pretty much his only chance to show the tower how capable he is, but Sion had to ruin it. Will thanks her for being worried about him, but he can still make it in time. He apologizes to Sion and says that they can finish the duel another time, but Sion still insists on settling the fight right now. Back at the stadium, the first team to arrive is Julius' team, and it seems like nothing can stop them now. But outside the stadium, Will is running at full speed, and just before Julius' team can claim the crown, he falls in the middle of the arena and tells Julius that it's time to settle this. In the magic tower, Elfaria is sitting peacefully by the window when her assistant, Sarissa, enters the room. At first, Sarissa apologizes for interrupting Elfaria's meditation, but then realizes that she is just sleeping, so she slaps her on the head. Elfaria wakes her up and complains that Sarissa didn't need to hit her so hard. But Sarissa tells her that she should take her status as a magic vendor more seriously, as being a magic vendor is a very important thing. And yet Elfaria spends most of her time sleeping, watching the world below. Elfaria asks Sarissa why she came to her, and Sarissa replies that she brought a list of promising candidates that the scouts selected. And as Elfaria looks over the list, Sarissa comments that the candidates for this year's festival are exceptional. But there is one who stands out among the rest because of his ice magic, and from his stats, Sarissa believes that he could even one day become Elfaria's successor as an ice magic vendor. Elfaria admits that Julius certainly looks promising, and that he could become her successor one day, but only if everything that has been reported about him is true. At the stadium, Will faces Julius and his team, and the winner will be whoever manages to grab the crown first. Julius could simply grab it since he is closer, but he would not be satisfied if he did not defeat and brutally humiliate Will in front of everyone. Will has no intention of losing, and prepares his sword. Then Julius begins his attack by casting a smoke screen. Will cannot see anything, but he can still hear the footsteps of 3 people around him. He realizes that Julius and his team must be trying to surround him and attack him from all directions. Suddenly, an ice ball comes flying towards Will from behind. He jumps out of the way and starts running to make himself a harder target to hit. Even with his vision block, he can still identify the location of his opponents by the sound. So, when 2 more ice balls fly at him, Will jumps to attack Julius. However, as he does so, he is surprised by a 4th attack. Will is thrown back and doesn't understand where the 4th attack could have come from, since he should only be facing 3 opponents. His confusion is only increased when he looks to the side and realizes that Julius and his team haven't even moved from their original positions. Still, Will is sure that he was being attacked by Julius. But now, suddenly, there are 5 of them. The first thing that comes to Will's mind is that this must be some kind of illusion magic. But the blows he is receiving are very real, and he soon realizes that the spell is too complex to be just a simple illusion. Julius is creating clones of himself, and a detail that he forgot to mention is that his clones also explode when he orders them to. One of these clones is right in front of Will. Then, when Julius gives the command, the clone explodes and envelops Will in a thick layer of ice. This turn of events is exciting, but the audience is more focused on trying to figure out what kind of magic Julius is using. However, Edward and Orkner immediately recognize the technique. Orkner explains that it is one of the secret arts discovered by the talented ice magic vendor, Elfaria. She has created and mastered 12 unique ice spells, and Julius is currently using the first in the series. This spell creates icy copies of the caster. Will is furious when he realizes that Julius is using a spell created by Elfaria. Julius just laughs and says that his natural talent allowed him to learn the spell on his own, studying it by himself. So even though it is only one of the 12 spells, Julius believes that he is now on par with a magic vendor, and this means that Elfaria is not that impressive, and that one day, he will surpass her and cast her out as a fraud. There are many things Will would let happen in his life: humiliation, insults. But someone calling Elfaria a fraud is something he cannot forgive, so he comes out of the ice and charges at Julius to make him regret those words. But Julius uses his clones to attack Will with more ice balls. His clones move exactly as he orders, and they can also use magic, so Julius can keep Will occupied for as long as he needs. And that's not all. Once Will is in the right position, Julius can cast his spell through his clones, sealing Will in an impenetrable barrier of ice. When Will is completely immobilized, Julius conjures a giant ice meteor and launches it directly at him. With nowhere to go, Will ends up being crushed. The audience starts to applaud Julius' incredible strength, and even Edward has to acknowledge his exceptional performance, as he won the battle without taking a single step with his real body. With all eyes on him, Julius takes the opportunity to declare that his ice magic has become unmatched after learning one of Elfaria's spells. He promises that he will become her successor as the next ice magic vendor. Julius did all this just to show off his power to the scouts, and the reports about him certainly seem real. But it would be terrible for his reputation if he ended up losing this fight, after everything he just said. In a moment, Julius hears the sound of ice cracking, and in total shock he turns around and sees his ice meteor shatter into pieces, while Will appears practically flat. Will thanks Julius for giving him time to calm down, as he has a bad habit of acting impulsively whenever someone belittles Elfaria's name, but he won't make that mistake again. Julius attacks Will once again with his ice clones, but this time, Will calmly dodges the attacks and appears behind Julius's teammate. In one swift move, Will knocks them both out, and as he does so, Julius's ice clones fall to the ground. From the moment he saw Julius's clone spell, Will knew it was incomplete. Julius was able to use the spell briefly, but he was never able to maintain it for long. That's why he needed the help of his teammates to cast the spell. If he needs all that help just to mimic a fraction of Elfaria's power, then Julius is far from her match. Unlike guardian spells that act on their own volition, ice clones need to be actively controlled, and this requires a mental strength that Julius clearly does not have, as he needed the help of his team to use them effectively. In other words, Will is basically calling Julius a fraud. Julius is furious at Will's statement, so he tells him to shut up and attacks him with some of his ice roses. However, Will easily manages to cut through them all. When the roses hit the ground, they explode, creating another smokescreen and obstructing Will's vision long enough for Julius to launch his ice clones again. All of the clones start firing ice balls at Will, but he is able to easily dodge their attacks. Julius hates to admit it, but what Will said about his clone spell being incomplete is true. The most he can do alone is 4 clones, and without the help of his friends, he has limited control over all the clones, so the best he can do is stay on the defensive. However, Will should have no way of knowing which one is the real Julius, since all the clones are a perfect image of him, so Will supposedly never find him. But this is not an obstacle for Will, who manages to find the real Julius, and the real one, upon being discovered, despairs and builds a wall to defend himself from Will's sword. But he breaks through it and sends Julius flying with a piece of his own ice. Julius does not understand how Will could have found him so quickly, since all the clones are identical. But then Will remembers a fundamental difference. The clones are made of ice. The body temperature of the ice clones is exactly the opposite of the body temperature of the conjurer, which means that they are very cold. Normally, with good control, the conjurer can avoid the low temperature of his clones being detected. But Julius does not have that level of control over his clones, which cause the cold to cause ice to form under the feet of all the clones. Julius does not understand how someone who cannot use magic knows the ins and outs of this spell better than he does. But there is a simple reason for this. Will has been friends with Euphoria since they were children, so he has seen her magic very closely, which is why Will knows all the strengths and weaknesses of Euphoria's magic. Julius despairs and tries to fire another shard of ice at Will, but he barely moves as he slashes through the attack, and Julius falls completely defeated. Will says that he respects Julius and his talent, and that it is true that so far, no mage has been able to replicate one of Euphoria's spells. But he has more news for him. Euphoria invented this clone spell when she was only 2 years old, so this is far from a perfect spell. However, Julius Julius is showing off this spell as if he is even superior to Wistoria. Will's words make Julius feel very stupid, as he thought he was an elite mage for replicating a Magiavender's spell, when in reality he was bragging about copying a child's achievement all along. Even though he thinks this is all crazy, he doesn't want to let it stop him from defeating a Magiavender. Julius screams in anger and summons 8 clones around him. Will can see that Julius is getting very nervous, and it's obvious that he's also trying his best, but Will has already had to deal with 10 clones of Wistoria, who always bullied him when he was a child, so 8 clones of Julius are hardly a challenge for him. As Julius casts the spells, Will runs forward, dodging and stabbing one of Julius' clones right in the head. Julius sees this and realizes that it could have happened to him. The fear of what Will could do to him makes him tremble. Will continues to attack and destroy the clones along the way, and no matter what Julius throws at him, Will is always one step ahead and blocks everything easily. Finally, Will destroys all the clones, leaving only the real Julius, and to finish him off, Will runs towards him with his fists clenched and punches Julius so hard that the scene ends up being repeated 3 times just to show this beautiful moment. With that, Will finally defeats Julius, and everyone in the audience starts cheering for him.